Getting your PhD in globalist books. A PhD in globalist books, and now it looks like the scientific outlook. Yeah, you're only gonna get your PhD from me in globalist books. PhD in globalist books, that's what the stash is for. That's what the stash is for. Please say you want more. The stash is for globalist books. Months and months of globalist books to come. Oh yeah. That was all improv. Beautiful singing. The voice. And yes, the stash was improv. I just improvised the stash to come upon my face. We're going to do globalist books as I promised. The first one up, The Scientific Outlook by the great villain himself, Bertrand Russell. This book, now I'd read selections and chapters of this book before, but I had not read the entire book cover to cover. And then when I went and did it, whoa, blown away, man. I mean, get ready. This is next level. Dyer from Jay's Knowledge said you can get my book Esoteric Hollywood, which actually goes into a lot of this information from a movie standpoint, a lighter perspective. A lot of fun. This book, it now has like 100 5-star reviews. Definitely something that you'll want to check out. Get it directly from Jay's analysis. So yeah, I finally plowed through Scientific Outlook, and I'm going to plow through The Impact of Science on Society next. We've got a whole stack. We've got a bunch of H.G. Wells books, Jacques Attali. We're going to be dealing with all those in the next several weeks. So this is written in 1931, and again, Russell is known as the foremost logician of the 20th century, which I think is odd, because in many ways he's actually also a propagandist, much like H.G. Wells will be a propagandist for scientism and the dogmas of empiricism, materialism, determinism, etc., etc. So what we're going to do is cover the outline of basics here in this, the hardcore stuff, and then really deep stuff, the in-depth, hardcore, hard-hitting quotes, one after another, in the full audio and video for Jay's Analysis subscribers. And you can subscribe at Jay's Analysis for $4.95 a month or for $60 a year. Also watch my TV show, Hollywood Decoded, which is streaming at the Gaia Network. You can also purchase that from Amazon Prime if you're an Amazon Prime user. So the first thing that's odd about this book is that the introduction, the preface in the version that I have, admits by this character, David Papineau, he admits that this is all based upon the real plans to bring in the Brave New World. The beginning of the philosophy here is atomism and relativism. There's no objective truth. There's only the flux of the external world, and then the interpretation that we impose upon it, which never says anything true about the real world. So pragmatism and relativism are the starting point. The end result is the state. The state becomes God. The state is the arbiter of what's true and what's false. Now, Bertrand Russell will play the liberal, and this is important to understand that he's not an actual liberal. He is very much on board with this plan because he sees it as the natural corollary to evolutionary process. This is very important because we're going to see that for Bertrand Russell, evolution is never clearly defined. It's just as elastic as the science that he proposes. Now, I am 100% pro-science. I did a lot of analytical philosophy in my undergrad and grad school days, and I also enjoyed intensely a lot of the philosophy of science classes I took. So I'm very much a fan of science, and in many ways this is actually a book on the philosophy of science. But the problem is that Russell wants to, with his Royal Society connections, and by the way, he admits that this is admitted as that all of modern scientism essentially spews forth from the Royal Society on page 23, where he discusses Charles II. So propaganda is important because what we see is that Russell starts immediately with the Dark Ages, which is a propaganda idea from Voltaire. There were many inventors and philosophers and scientists prior to Voltaire throughout the Middle Ages. So first of all, that's not true. We're told that Galileo, Darwin, Newton, Pavlov, and Freud are the new heroes of the new era. Now, that might be true in a sense in terms of propaganda, but they're not actual heroes, because each one of these characters was essentially in many ways propagandized to be the fathers of modernity, and as Russell says explicitly, to destroy older existing cultures, traditions, notions, and ideas. So the modern Anglo and by extension Zionist ideologies are absolutely interested in promoting liberalism, promoting relativism and pragmatism, and that's because they are based on a kind of weird hermeticism. And you find this, actually, he will admit that Newton, Kepler, these characters were actually involved in hermeticism. He strangely admits, well, actually doesn't admit that about Newton. He does admit that about Kepler and other characters, that they were influenced by Zoroastrianism in their scientism. Russell will go on to say that he's a huge fan of J.B. Watson and Pavlov, also great heroes of modernity, because they discovered the scientific technique for controlling men, controlling men's minds through operant conditioning and conditioned reflexes. So the dog training, the bell, and so forth, like you experienced in your public school education when the bell rang and told you that it was time to go get your slice of plastic pizza and your milk bag. Maybe you had milk cartons at your school. My school had milk bags, a bag of milk, so-called milk. The purpose of all this was that since there's no more telos in nature, no purpose in nature, Russell says, it's all been replaced by the experts, the managerial society, and the guys like Watson and Pavlov who are going to tell you what reality is. So out with metaphysics, except wait, we're going to give you a new metaphysic, which is radical materialism. Now, Russell admits, by the way, which is surprising, that materialism is a kind of dogma. It's a presupposition, he says. It's not really proven. It's hard to know exactly what we mean when we say that the world is just atomism and materialism. But that's okay, because dogmas no longer matter unless they're the dogmas given by the scientific state. That's what he says. So we are looking at hardcore relativism, hardcore mind control, which he admits numerous times in the book. He says that the state of the future, he's writing in 1931, will be creating GMO babies, boys with titties, girls with, I don't even want to say, gets worse and worse and worse. Test tube babies coming out of test tubes like it's horror movie. Oh my goodness. The freaks of nature will be designed on purpose. Yes, he says that. All at the service of the scientific state. And that's because, as we said, these heroes of modernity have completely bashed and destroyed all previous ideologies. And guess what? Even though, yes, they used to teach metaphysics and they used to teach theology, Russell says, yeah, we tossed all that out. But yeah, we are going to give you a new metaphysic, and it's called radical materialism. And yeah, it's a metaphysic, but we call it science. It's a presupposition, but we call it science because we say what science is. And that's what's the interesting point in the first half of this book, is in the treatment of the heroes of science, the Hall of Scientific Saints. And in the definitions of science, Russell gives about 30 different conflicting explanations and definitions of what, quote, science is. And that's very important because science is now the new religion. But Russell says this. He says they're the high priests. He says the people in Hollywood and the so-called scientists are the new high priests of the new world order, new world religion. They dictate reality. They dictate truth and falsehood. Now, he's right about that. But again, he has no problem with any of this. He sees himself as simply stating the facts of how societies and cultures and humans evolve. So it's all just perfectly natural, because anything that happens is, quote, natural in Russell's view, because of deterministic materialism, naturalistic deterministic materialism. The fallacy of the naturalist fallacy, in other words, which is the big critique that we're going to start with when we do the critique of this book. But we have to point out the many multifarious definitions of science and scientific method. Now, science, I believe, and again, I spent a lot of time studying this, and grad and undergrad, science is a tool for investigating the natural world. It's a tool for discovering means by which you can create some artifice that will make, life easier. It's a way to discover natural processes, etc., etc. So nobody, I don't think, has any problem with any of that, and everybody knows that this tool works in the same way that a hammer works. It's a tool. But I can't take a hammer, here's a pen, this pen's a tool, and say that the tool shows me the grand narrative of how the world operates and what exists in the world. Because it's a tool. It doesn't have the ability to create a grand narrative. It'd be like, pen! Pen is the creator of all! Hail the pen! Look at great pen God! Pen God created all. Right? Nobody would believe that, right? That's absurd. But the exact same thing goes on with Russell when he will say that scientific method is the replacement of providence. He actually says that. So what are all the things? So he says, let's see, science is just basic empiricism, is one claim. Okay, so science is a specific view of epistemology? Well, first of all, that's not true. Science is not just empiricism, or else any empirical data would be, quote, science, but Russell doesn't believe that. Scientific opinion is one that has reasons. Well, any position can have, any opinion or position can have reasons. So, I mean, that's, again, too broad. I mean, that could mean anything. The only scientific opinions provide only probable certitudes. Well, the first question I would have is that a probable certitude, or is that absolutely certain? If that's absolutely certain and that's your starting point, then you've already contradicted yourself because you said that there are no absolute certain starting points. Scientific knowledge is of general laws and facts. Well, that assumes that these general laws and facts actually exist in the external world, which Russell actually later says they do not. They do not actually exist in the world. They are mental human constructs, social constructs. So there's a consistent, you'll notice, confusion between engineering, techne, and science or scientific method. This is a consistent fallacy that these people always engage in, the people that worship scientism. Science is just progress on one point. What does that mean? I thought, by the way, how does quantitative measure give you value judgments? It doesn't. Can't get a value judgment from quantitative measures, right? There's nothing that tells you what's good or bad, or better or lesser, just by having quantities. That assumes some sort of standard by which you can say one thing is good or bad or better or less. Those are metaphysical claims. Sorry. Science is the power of manipulating nature. Well, is that engineering? Because later in the book, he'll actually say that science and engineering aren't strictly exactly the same. Science is merely inductive methodology. Well, I got bad news for Mr. Russell. Anytime you try to do induction, you also necessarily presuppose some aspect of deduction. So there's no such thing as something that's completely inductive. The scientific method is almost omnipotent, he says. Sounds like a religion, doesn't it? The scientific knowledge does not stand alone, but it only exists within the general body of scientific knowledge. Page 37. So actually, there's no such thing as a brute fact. It requires a context to interpret some piece of data. That's a point that I've made countless times. Here's Russell admitting it. But a body of scientific data or opinions, scientific opinion, that's not fact. That's interpretive understanding, unless you've empirically verified what all of the body of scientists believe and say, which is not possible. Then that definition of what science is scientism. It's not actually scientific in its claim. It presupposes metaphysical claims that cannot be verified empirically, which is what we're supposed to believe science is. See? Science is based on the assumptions that are unverifiable, he says, admits at one point. Yes, we agree. Exactly. They're not empirically verifiable, the presuppositions of science, such as the scientific method itself. However, authority in science is not reliable, he later says. And hence the changing opinions of scientists over time. So now, if scientific opinion is not authoritative, then how are we supposed to believe that the assumptions upon which science is based are reliable or true given that they're unverifiable, according to Russell. Again, contradictory. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that I'm an obscurantist or I believe that there's no science. Again, absolutely. What I'm pointing out is that the radical scientism is the presupposition of scientific outlook. I mean, the name of the book tells you that, right? So I am not saying that the scientific method is problematic. It's a method. It's a tool, right? The pen method. The pen method is very useful as a tool for drawing unicorns and drawing mustaches on guys to make them into bad guys or whatever. But that's different from a grand narrative, and that's what this is presenting. A grand materialistic narrative that everything is evolving to a world government. What else is science? Science, unfortunately, he says, is in decay because of radical skepticism, he says, and because of quantum physics. That's a whole other bag. We're not going to get into all that right at this moment, but suffice to say that Russell himself admits that science is in decay. Well, if science is just the things that he's mentioned, basic empiricism, knowledge of universal laws and facts, why would that ever be in decay? If science is engineering and progress in technology, which he seems to say at other times, that's not in decay. No, what he means is that the assumptions of materialism are in decay. That's what he says in that chapter. Geometry has no real relation to the external world. So, moving on towards the end here, what else is science? Science is a systematic pursuit of knowledge. Science is an entire worldview about man and civilizations, page 104. Reason, which is involved in science, is merely a social construct of survival, evolutionary survival mechanism developed in children, 103. Death is merely a positive result of all of the evolutionary processes. Now, why do I say all this? Well, the point is that, here's the crux here. He says, science is all of these things, and many of these things are actually not science. They're different conflicting definitions and dealing with different things like engineering, which is not specifically the scientific method. And in many places he's admitted that this is actually a philosophy of a grand narrative explanation of reality in the world. It's a metaphysical presupposition, but we don't know anything about metaphysics. That's all been tossed out because that's theology and presupposition that's not empirically verified. The scientific method itself cannot be empirically verified. Now, that's a different. Again, Russell admits that. So those of you who are going to reply to me and say that it doesn't matter, we're just trying to be pragmatic. Right, I understand what pragmatism is, but again, I'm telling you that there's a really easy way to refute this, and it's very obvious and very clear. So Russell's very, very adamant that minds and souls and persons don't really exist. They're merely determined chemical reactions. Okay, so free will is an illusion. He's very dogmatic about that. Choice is an illusion. Your creativity is ultimately kind of illusory, right? As is yourself. Well, guess what? If that's the case, and if because of all determined causal reactions, right, everything that I'm saying, everything that I've done is merely a product of mindless, determined causal chains, then Bertrand Russell's book was not the production of the genius of Bertrand Russell. It was merely a chemical reaction of determined mindless process, and it actually tells you nothing about the real world. Now, that's absurd, but that's the conclusion that Russell's book would lead you to on his dogma, and it is a dogma. In fact, he even says that the scientific method ultimately is a kind of specialist mysticism that is hidden and removed from the average man because the average man just can't understand it, and the specialist knows all these things, and he can never ever convey that to the average man, and so therefore the scientific method is the true religion because of the specialists. Now, that's different though from the claim that science and the scientific method are just empirical knowledge. It's just empirical observation. It's just knowledge of causal bodies. Knowledge of causal bodies does not tell you that there's no free will, which are all metaphysical claims, and that all of reality is a giant mechanistic determined machine with no free will. You can't, on the one hand, be this skeptic and say that our geometry doesn't tell you anything about the real world, and then turn around and say, well, I know all about the real world. It's all just atoms smashing together. So that's the central transcendental refutation of Russell and scientism, or the naturalistic fallacy, the determinist fallacy, which totally refutes the whole thing. Similar to the problem of Wittgenstein. If words have no meaning, then you just wrote a book destroying the meaning of words, trying to use words conveying meaning, and you failed. So did Bertrand Russell, and that's the number one reason why we know that naturalistic materialism is not true. In the rest of this talk, I will deal with all of the other multitude of claims and the literal genocidal, rabid, savage attitude of anti-human devilry that he spews forth and vomits forth on every freaking page. He's going to predict Monsanto. He's going to say that you're going to eat slop. You're going to eat GMO that's going to give the boys titties. You're going to be born in test tubes. You're going to be killed off. Lenin is the model. Vladimir Lenin is the model for the coming technocrat. They're going to merge capitalism and communism, he says. You're all going to live in communal giant dorms. You're not going to have your own property. Everything's going to be surveilled. It's all in this 1931 book, 2 years prior to Brave New World. So you can hear that at Jay's Analysis. Subscribe for $4.95 a month, $60 a year. We are going to knock down book by book by book by book every one of the globalist top books. Thank you for watching.